June 1940. Britain's back was against the wall. The triumphant headlines of 1918 had long faded. In their place were blackened harbours, Spartan ration cards, and the constant thrum of aircraft engines above the city. It was into that air, brittle, electric with fear and possibility, that one very English kind of genius stepped, not a field marshal, not a politician, but a mathematician-engineer with a taste for peculiar problems and a hatred for bureaucratic no. His name was Millis Jefferis, and what he would build out of scrap, solder, and the impatience of war would become for many people the closest thing the British had to a secret weapon workshop, a place nicknamed, with equal parts affection and exasperation, Winston Churchill's Toyshop. Millis Jefferis was not a swaggering inventor in a lab coat. He was a soldier first, a Royal Engineers officer trained at Woolwich and tempered in the hard schoolrooms of the British Empire. Born in Surrey in 1899 and educated at Tunbridge and the Royal Military Academy, he had been commissioned into the Royal Engineers at the end of the First World War and spent years in India and on the Army's engineering staff. Those years taught him two indispensable things: how to make things work in unpromising places and how to read a problem until it surrendered its simplest, most brutal solution. When war returned in 1939, Britain needed inventors who could think laterally, people who didn't ask permission for the obvious and who would accept the mess of prototypes and the smoke of burnt-out solder as the price of experimentation. Jefferis was recruited into a small hush-hush cell known initially as Military Intelligence Research, MIR, which was charged with making weapons for irregular warfare, gadgets, traps and bombs that could be carried in a coat pocket and do the work of an army. The unit's technical section, which Jefferis led, was soon pulling odd couples of journalists, engineers and hobbyists from quiet civilian lives and throwing them into the same room to see what landed. These were not the genteel laboratories of official ministries. These were guerrilla workshops where the accepted rules were optional. Jefferis brought to the table an engineer's temperament and a physicist's curiosity. He relished puzzles: how to make a charge that could be stuck to a ship's hull, how to squeeze enormous penetrating power from a small warhead, how to fit death into a man's travel kit without being detected. One of the first seeds of legend was a small article in a popular science magazine about powerful, rare magnets. Jefferis read it and saw not a curiosity, but a weapon, the possibility of a small magnet-backed mine that a swimmer could attach to an enemy ship, let go, and leave to do its work on a timer. It was a thought that would lead, after furious tinkering, to what would become the Limpet Mine, a deceptively simple device with a savage effect. The workshop, where Jefferis and his colleagues laboured, moved through a series of kitchens and basements until it found a country house requisitioned by the War Office called the Firs in Whitchurch, Buckinghamshire. Here, behind high hedges and the pretence of normal country life, Jefferis and a few dozen engineers, artificers and oddball scientists turned a Tudor mansion into a production line of ingenuity. The place soon acquired its affectionate nickname, Winston Churchill's Toyshop, a name that captured both the childlike joy of invention and the secret seriousness of what they were making. It was deliberately removed from standard ministry control, an island where can't and won't were to be tested and then discarded. Jefferis was put in charge of MD1, the Ministry of Defence's compact, freewheeling technical arm. He was seconded by Stuart McCrae, an urbane tinkerer with journalism roots who would later write the inside story of the place. The two men complemented and sometimes clashed with one another: Jefferis, the methodical engineer; McCrae, the theatrical experimenter who loved publicity and spectacle. Together they turned eccentric curiosity into sanctioned strategy. Early triumphs were at once modest and audacious. The Limpet Mine, essentially a timed explosive fitted with powerful magnets and a waterproof casing, solved a problem the Navy and the clandestine services had wrestled with since 1939: how to destroy enemy shipping covertly. Jefferis's version was small, handleable, and designed specifically for covert assault teams. The workshop tried, failed, and tried again. Magnets corroded in salt water, fuses went off too soon, or not at all. The bombs could be spotted while being carried. The testing was primitive by civilian standards and rigorous by military necessity. Boats at night, divers in cold water, clocks and detonators that had to be more reliable than any creative engineer's pride. When the design finally worked reliably, it quickly became the tool of daring operations. Raids, where men paddled in under moonlight to place mines on hulls, and then slipped away, while explosions turned harbors into graveyards of shipping. Those missions, Jaywick, Frankton, and others, would later become legend in their own right, each a breadcrumb back to that little country house where a magnet and a fuse had been coaxed into service. Jefferis's genius, though, was not merely in one elegant device. He ran MD1 as a crucible for solutions. If something needed to be done and existing channels were clogged by caution, Jefferis's shop found a way around the logjam. Sticky bombs, an idea for an anti-tank charge that would adhere to enemy armor. The PIAT anti-tank launcher, disguised demolition charges, boarding explosives, and even sleeve guns that could be hidden on a man's arm, all passed through the forge he supervised. Some projects were spectacular successes, others failed with noisome, humiliating gusto. The important thing was that ideas were tried quickly, iterated, and either hardened into service or thrown away. In wartime, perfection was less valuable than practicality. The urgency of Jefferis's work is best understood in human terms. Imagine a small, cramped workshop with a clack of rivets, the hiss of acetylene torches, and the smell of cordite. Engineers argued about angles and the metallurgy of magnets. Technicians went wet from toil in test pools. A nervous colonel from naval intelligence showed up with an intelligence report demanding a way to sink an enemy liner without losing a whole flotilla. Jefferis paced, thought, scribbled numbers, and made the men try again. He did not have the patience for red tape. "If the Navy wants a mine," he might have said, "we will give it a mine, and if the Admiralty asks how we did it, they will be asked to thank the men who did." Those are the kinds of disputes and quips that later turned into legend, but they carry a kernel of truth. Jefferis's temperament tilted toward action. Not every scene was buoyant. There were near disasters, and the stakes were real. One vivid episode, later recounted by some of the participants, involved a bathtub test. A prototype limpet was lashed under a small craft for a night trial. Something in the fuse mechanism failed, and the device detonated too early, smashing the test boat and nearly costing lives. The men at the Firs learned quickly that mistakes here were not theoretical. Each failed test had to be catalogued, reasons extracted, and designs hardened. Improvisation was a teacher as much as gravity. Stuart McCrae's later book, written with affection and frankness, records these experiments with a kind of affectionate horror. The toys they played with were deadly serious. The military bureaucracy, predictably, did not always understand the toy shop. Jefferis ran into resistance from ministries who feared embarrassment or loss of control. There were officials who distrusted the slippery business of irregular weapons, devices that blurred the line between soldier and saboteur, between lawful combat and clandestine action. Jefferis needed patrons. He found one in Winston Churchill, who famously liked men who made things happen. By operating as a small, nimble unit reporting directly to the Minister of Defence and with the tacit blessing of Churchill and the War Cabinet, MD1 could bypass many of the usual choke points. The freedom to prototype quickly and then to scale up production when something worked was the toy shop's real genius. And scale up they did. A successful prototype translated within months into thousands of field copies. The Limpet Mine's early tests were followed by specialized manufacturing runs. The sticky bomb's rough edges were smoothed enough to be issued to airborne troops. The PIAT became a standard anti-tank weapon. Jefferis's team did not just invent, they shepherded, often against doubts, the painful logistics of turning a prototype into quantity. A task that involved not just engineering but persuasion, paperwork, and sometimes direct intervention with senior commanders. That mix of grease, paper, and graft is the unglamorous heart of how ideas became instruments of war, yet even with success, personalities frayed. Jefferis could be impatient, blunt, and intolerant of people who hid behind regulations. His manager, Stuart McCrae, brought to MD1 a knack for storytelling and public relations that Jefferis neither needed nor always wanted. Their partnership, effective, combustible, and sometimes affectionate, produced one of the great wartime paradoxes, a secret organization that thrived on publicity inside its own walls but could not be allowed to be famous in the public square. McCrae later wrote about the place with affection. Jefferis kept his head down and let results do the speaking. The presence of both temperaments, one brash and communicative, the other focused and methodical, was essential. Together they made sure that wild ideas were put to the test, then either cut loose or fastened into the kit bags of commandos and raiders. The extraordinary thing about Jefferis is not merely the list of devices that flowed from his unit, but the ethos he cultivated. Small inventions, tested quickly and used with imagination. In a war where victory would be decided by logistics and attrition as much as by great battles, these nimble tools offered asymmetric advantage. A few limpet mines in a harbour could deny the enemy tonnage and buy a strategic breath. A sticky bomb in a Normandy hedgerow could make a German tank commander think twice. In the dimly lit sheds and country houses of Britain's home front, Jefferis and his men were converting ingenuity into leverage and leverage into lives saved and missions accomplished. By the time the machines, the toys and the bombs or tis were in the field, Jefferis's reputation had hardened into a kind of myth. He was officially decorated for his service and later rose to senior rank. Yet like many wartime innovators whose work was secret, much of the credit was slow to surface. When histories were finally written and veterans told their stories, the traces of Jefferis's work appeared in dramatic raids and in the scars on enemy harbours. The Toyshop might have sounded whimsical, but its output left a bitter, functional mark on the map of war. It was not always pretty. There were moral and practical ambiguities in making sabotage efficient. But it was decisive. By the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone in Europe. France had fallen with terrifying speed, leaving the Channel exposed and London braced for an uncertain future. The Luftwaffe patrolled the skies, its engines a constant drumbeat over a city already stiff with fear. Into this fraught atmosphere stepped Major Millis Jefferis, a man whose genius did not lie in commanding armies, but in commanding ideas. He was a soldier, an engineer, and a problem solver whose ambition was matched only by the peculiar demands of the war itself. Jefferis's approach was methodical yet unorthodox. He was not interested in what the rules allowed, but in what could be achieved. The Royal Engineers officer, trained at Woolwich and tempered by service across India and the British Empire, carried the discipline of military life and the restless curiosity of an inventor into the secret spaces of the Ministry of Defence. Jefferis's assignment was extraordinary. He was placed in charge of a small, clandestine unit that would eventually be called MD1, the Ministry of Defence's experimental department for irregular warfare. Its task was simple in description but impossible in practice: devise weapons that were portable, effective, and capable of giving Britain an advantage where conventional forces could not. The unit's resources were minimal, its oversight ambiguous, and its freedom nearly complete. Jefferis became the hub around which a unique network of engineers, scientists, technicians, and even journalists orbited, drawn by the promise of invention and the thrill of breaking rules without being reprimanded. The headquarters of this operation shifted several times, from borrowed basements to inconspicuous country houses, but it eventually settled at the first, a Tudor mansion in Whitchurch, Buckinghamshire. Here, behind hedges and unremarkable facades, Britain's Toyshop began to take shape. The Firs was more than a workshop. It was a laboratory, a testing ground, and, at times, a crucible of human endurance. Each room was adapted to the work at hand. One contained tanks and shallow pools for testing magnetic charges in simulated waterways. Another housed benches cluttered with scales, calipers, and intricate mechanical components. The smell of oil, metal, and cordite hung perpetually in the air. Sparks flew from acetylene torches and soldering irons, and the occasional small explosion reminded all present that this was not a place for timidity. Jefferis moved through this environment like a conductor, orchestrating experiments that balanced delicacy with danger. His attention to detail was legendary, from the precise curvature of a magnet's housing to the exact timing of a fuse. Failure was permitted but studied exhaustively. Every misfire, every corrosion problem, and every miscalculation was catalogued and analyzed, informing the next iteration. Among the earliest and most celebrated inventions to emerge from the Firs was the Limpet Mine, a small, magnetic explosive designed for covert sabotage of enemy shipping. The concept was deceptively simple. A swimmer would carry the device underwater, attach it to a vessel's hull, and leave it to detonate after a timed delay. Yet achieving reliability proved to be a monumental engineering challenge. Magnets corroded in salt water, fuses detonated prematurely, and divers became disoriented during trials. Jefferis and his team subjected the devices to repeated testing, often under adverse conditions, to refine their function. The work was painstaking, exacting, and occasionally perilous. A diver misjudging the magnetic force could be pulled violently against the test hull. A miscalibrated timer could trigger the device too early, destroying the test boat and narrowly missing its operators. Despite these hazards, the team's perseverance yielded success, producing a compact, dependable weapon that would become a cornerstone of British clandestine operations. The Limpet Mine was only the beginning. Jefferis's team next tackled the challenge of the sticky bomb, an anti-tank device meant to adhere to enemy armor. This invention was audacious in concept, a glass sphere filled with explosive, coated in adhesive and encased in a protective canvas bag. In practice, its deployment required nerve, timing, and precision. Field trials were chaotic. Adhesive failed in wet conditions, and the explosive sometimes reacted unpredictably. Yet the principle was sound, and under Jefferis's guidance, refinements produced a weapon that could be used effectively by infantry facing armored vehicles. Churchill himself reportedly appreciated the device's audacity, recognizing that the danger it posed to the enemy outweighed the operational challenges. By the end of 1941, the British Army was manufacturing sticky bombs in large numbers, ready for an invasion that ultimately never materialized, but for which the nation had prepared. Parallel to these achievements, Jefferis continued to pursue innovation in other areas. The development of the PIAT, or projector infantry, anti-tank, was a direct descendant of his earlier spigot mortar experiments. The PIAT allowed infantrymen to launch a shaped charge with lethal precision at close range, eliminating the need for heavy stationary artillery. Designing the PIAT required integrating mechanical power, human ergonomics, and explosive physics into a compact, rugged device that could be mass-produced and fielded under the extreme conditions of combat. Jefferis oversaw countless prototypes, tested under simulated battle conditions, with soldiers providing feedback on usability, recoil, and deployment speed. The iterative process was laborious but effective, resulting in a weapon that, while awkward, delivered devastating results against German armor in campaigns from Sicily to Normandy. The environment at the Firs was intense, sustained by the urgency of wartime necessity. Jefferis's team worked long hours, often through nights, punctuated by air raid sirens and blackouts. The pressure to innovate was constant. The War Office, cautious and bureaucratic, frequently questioned the expenditure of resources on unorthodox projects. Jefferis's approach was a careful balancing act to satisfy the demands of oversight while protecting the unit's freedom to experiment. He maintained direct communication with Churchill's scientific advisor, Lord Cherwell, ensuring the toy shop had a shield against interference. Bureaucratic friction, however, was only one of the challenges. Technical failures, material shortages, and the unpredictability of human behavior in field trials posed equally pressing obstacles. Yet under Jefferis's leadership, the unit flourished. He fostered a culture where creativity and practical problem-solving were inseparable, and where failure was viewed not as shameful, but as an opportunity to learn an essential step toward functional design. The cumulative effect of Jefferis's innovations extended far beyond their immediate tactical applications. The Limpet Mine and sticky bomb changed the calculus of covert operations, enabling commandos and special forces to achieve objectives previously considered impossible. The PIAT allowed infantry to confront armored vehicles on more equal terms, shifting the balance in localized engagements. But perhaps more importantly, the toy shop itself became a model for unconventional problem-solving in military contexts. Its combination of intellectual freedom, rapid prototyping, and direct accountability to the highest levels of government demonstrated that inventive energy could compensate for limited resources and that small, dedicated teams could achieve disproportionate impact. Jefferis's personal dedication was reflected in every aspect of the workshop. He would often work alongside technicians, soldering components, measuring fuse delays, and observing field trials. His stamina was remarkable. Long hours, minimal rest, and constant mental engagement were the norm. Colleagues remembered him as intensely focused, with a mind that operated almost continuously. Even in moments of exhaustion, Jefferis could identify flaws, propose solutions, and direct modifications with clarity and decisiveness. His ability to synthesize technical knowledge, practical constraints, and operational requirements was unparalleled, and it was this skill that allowed the toy shop to succeed where conventional bureaucracies faltered. By the war's midpoint, the toy shop had produced a string of practical, deployable devices, each with its own story of trial and triumph. These inventions were not celebrated publicly, yet they had tangible effects on the battlefield. Small British raiding parties equipped with limpet mines disrupted shipping in Norwegian fjords and French harbours. Sticky bombs gave infantry the capacity to neutralize armored threats during defensive operations. The PIAT became an essential part of infantry arsenals, valued for its reliability under fire. Each success was a testament to the blend of ingenuity, perseverance, and calculated risk that defined Jefferis's leadership. While the toy shop thrived, its operations remained shrouded in secrecy. Even as the war progressed and victories accumulated, Jefferis and his team worked largely unacknowledged. The ministry's official channels rarely documented their efforts, and public awareness was non-existent. The unit's output was measured not in medals or headlines, but in operational impact. Ships damaged or destroyed, tanks disabled, sabotage missions completed, and lives saved through clever innovation. Jefferis's genius was ultimately in creating a culture where ideas could be transformed into action with minimal delay and maximal effect. When the guns fell silent in 1945, Britain emerged victorious but exhausted, scarred by years of conflict and uncertainty. For Major Millis Jefferis, the end of the war was not a relief, but a disorienting silence. The urgency that had defined his life, rapid experimentation, relentless deadlines, and constant problem-solving, was suddenly gone. The workshops at the Firs were emptied, machines dismantled, and classified designs returned to the Ministry of Supply. Every tool, every half-completed prototype, and every stack of blueprints became either property of the government or subject to the Official Secrets Act. To the public, the toy shop had never existed. There were no plaques, no commendations, no announcements in newspapers. In one day, an entire engine of ingenuity was quietly shuttered, leaving its creators adrift in a post-war landscape that valued bureaucratic order over unorthodox brilliance. Jefferis was offered a position in a conventional administrative role at the Ministry of Supply, a place where the pace was measured in committee meetings, safety reviews, and paperwork. He lasted less than a month. The precision, immediacy, and improvisational freedom that had allowed him to create devices like the Limpet Mine and the PIAT were absent in the sanitized corridors of peacetime bureaucracy. He resigned and retreated to Surrey, selling his London home and purchasing a modest property with a barn that he converted into a private workshop. Here there were no orders, no deadlines, and no intrusions, only the quiet hum of machinery and the faint smell of solder and oil. He tinkered endlessly, designing agricultural gadgets, miniature demolition devices, and even a prototype self-igniting gas stove. None of these inventions saw commercial or military adoption, yet the process of creation remained essential to him. To neighbors, he was polite but distant, a man of habitual routines who sometimes muttered calculations while tending birds or tending his small garden. His world had contracted from the scale of global conflict to the intimate space of his workshop, yet the intensity of his focus remained unchanged. Even as Jefferis receded into obscurity, the tools he had created lived on, often in forms he would never see. The PIAT, originally designed as a crude but effective shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon, influenced post-war infantry armaments and shoulder-launched rockets in multiple Allied armies. Its shaped charge principles were foundational, studied by engineers across Europe and North America. The Limpet Mine became a standard device for British and Allied naval frogmen well into the Cold War, its magnetic attachment system adapted for underwater demolition and covert operations. Jefferis's time pencils, simple delay-action fuses, remained in service for decades, used by commandos, resistance fighters, and special operations units around the world. Every sabotage mission, every strategically timed demolition, and every bridge or rail line destroyed with British-designed explosives carried, indirectly, the imprint of Jefferis's mind. For decades, however, his contributions were hidden beneath layers of classification. It was not until the 1960s that researchers and journalists began to glimpse the scope of MD1's accomplishments. Declassified files revealed hundreds of pages of memos, requisitions, and sketches detailing devices that had never seen the battlefield. Prototypes included magnetized torpedoes designed to cling to enemy ships from aircraft, silent grenades using compressed air for covert assassinations, and hand-cranked anti-aircraft launchers intended for paratrooper units. While many of these inventions were never deployed, they demonstrated a mind unbounded by convention, capable of conceiving solutions to problems most had not yet imagined. Historians recognized in Jefferis not just an engineer, but a visionary who embodied the ethos of applied imagination under pressure. Dr. Robert Church, a British ordnance historian, later summarized his work as practical ingenuity in extremis, the kind of thinking that saved lives by bending the rules of war without breaking them. The influence of Jefferis's work persisted well into the post-war era. Early Cold War units, including the Special Operations Executive's successors, adapted several MD1 designs for clandestine operations in Asia and Europe. Modified PIAT charges were used as bunker-busting tools in Korea, while demolition tools inspired by Toyshop Inventions became standard equipment for counter-insurgency operations in Malaya. Jefferis's contributions were, in effect, ghosted into the infrastructure of modern special operations, shaping strategy and tactics without his name ever appearing in official records. Despite the lack of recognition, his principles, rapid prototyping, iterative testing, and creative risk-taking, became the blueprint for future defense innovation laboratories across Britain, demonstrating that small, determined teams could achieve strategic advantage where conventional methods failed. Yet Jefferis himself remained largely invisible to history. He lived his final years in the Surrey countryside, a solitary figure in a barn workshop that smelled perpetually of machine oil and metal filings. The quiet was punctuated only by the soft hum of soldering irons and the occasional crackle of a wireless set reporting news from a world increasingly dominated by rockets, satellites, and atomic weapons. The transition from wartime urgency to post-war tranquility was not easy. Colleagues remembered him as almost machine-like in his dedication, able to work for days without rest, yet, paradoxically, fragile outside the controlled chaos of invention. Health issues, exacerbated by years of relentless labor, eventually caught up with him. In 1963, Jefferis passed away, his obituary in the Times a mere 150 words, noting only his service in experimental munitions. No mention was made of the Toyshop, its devices, or the lives they had affected. Rediscovery of his legacy came slowly. Exhibitions, archival research, and declassified war cabinet minutes in the late 20th and early 21st centuries revealed the true scope of his impact. Between 1940 and 1945, MD1 had developed over 50 original weapons, producing more than 2.5 million devices under Churchill's direct authority. The ingenuity, speed, and precision of the department had been pivotal in bridging Britain's gap between vulnerability and survival. Museums now display limpet mines, PIATs, sticky bombs, and other devices, often accompanied by explanatory plaques noting Jefferis's role. Visitors express astonishment. The idea that one man could conceive, test, and deploy so many groundbreaking weapons in secret is difficult to reconcile with the familiar narratives of war dominated by generals and soldiers. Jefferis's philosophy was elegantly simple. War is not merely a contest of men or material, but a contest of ideas. The fastest, most practical, and most inventive mind can achieve outcomes disproportionate to its size or resources. His methods broke every conventional rule of military engineering, yet they saved lives and achieved objectives that might otherwise have seemed impossible. This approach, calculated improvisation, rapid iteration, and an almost obsessive attention to detail, remains a model for creative problem-solving in both military and civilian contexts. Post-war British laboratories and innovation centres, from Fort Halstead to the Defence Research Establishment, drew inspiration from the organisational and conceptual framework established at the FIRS, embedding Jefferis's ethos into the fabric of modern defence research. In the end, Jefferis's legacy is measured not by medals or public acclaim, but by the tangible effects of his inventions. Bridges that were destroyed to slow enemy movement, tanks neutralized on the battlefield, ships disabled in enemy harbors. These were silent monuments to his creativity. Beyond immediate military success, his work inspired generations of engineers, inventors, and strategists to prioritize ingenuity, speed, and practicality over ceremony and bureaucracy. In a war defined by destruction, Major Millis Jefferis demonstrated that creation, intelligent, bold, and adaptive, could itself be a form of defiance. He is commemorated in a modest gravestone in a Surrey churchyard, Major Millis Jefferis, OBE, 1899 to 1963, engineer and soldier. The marker makes no mention of Churchill, of the Toyshop, or of the countless covert victories his devices enabled. Yet the world that emerged from the Second World War, its special operations, clandestine raids, and unconventional weapons programs, bears the indelible mark of his mind. In every clever solution to a seemingly impossible problem, in every successful, covert mission, and in every innovation born from necessity, Jefferis's spirit continues to echo. He was not a warrior in the traditional sense, but a warrior of imagination. Through him, Britain learned that even in the darkest hours, the marriage of intellect, creativity, and determination could wield power equal to armies.